here we have the poetic experience itself. We have Chapman, George Chapman, the friend and rival of Shakespeare, being dead and suddenly coming into life, suddenly coming back into life when John Keats read his Iliads or his Odysseys. I think it was of George Chapman, but I am not a Shakespearean scholar, that Shakespeare was thinking when he wrote, "Was it the proud full sail of his great verse, bound for the prize of all too precious you?" And there is a word that seems to me very important, and the word is on first looking into Chapman's Homer. Because this first may, I think, prove most helpful to us. At the very moment when I was going over those mighty lines of Chapman, I was thinking that perhaps I was only being loyal to my memory. Perhaps the real thrill I got out of the verses of Keats lay in that distant moment of my childhood in Buenos Aires when I first heard my father reading them up aloud, and when the fact that poetry, that language, was not only a medium for communication, but could also be a passion and a joy, was revealed to me. I do not think I understood the words, but I felt that something was happening to me, was happening not to my mere intelligence, but to my whole being, to my flesh and blood. And now, let's go back to the words on first looking into Chapman's Homer. I wonder if John Keats felt that thrill when he had gone through the many books of the Iliads and the Odysseys. I think the first reading of a poem is a true one, and after that we delude ourselves into the belief that the sensation, that the impression is repeated. But, as I say, it may be a mere loyalty, a mere trick of the memory, a mere confusion between our passion and the passion we once felt. Thus, it might be said that poetry is a new experience every time. Every time I read a poem, the experience occurs or happens to occur, and that is poetry. I read once that the American painter Whistler was in a cafe in Paris, and people were discussing the influence of heredity, of the environment, of the political state of the times, and so on the artist. And then Whistler said, "Art happens." That is to say, there is something mysterious about art. And I would like to take his words, but to take them in a new sense. I should say, art happens every time we read a poem. And this may help us to clear away, I hope I am mistaken here, the time-honored notion of the classics, the idea of everlasting books, of books where one may always find beauty. Perhaps I may give a brief survey of the history of books. As far as I remember, the Greeks had no use for books or no great use for them. It is a fact, indeed, that most of the great teachers of mankind have been not writers, but speakers. Let us think of Pythagoras, of Christ, of Socrates, of the Buddha, and so on. And since I have spoken of Socrates, I would like to say something about Plato. I remember Bernard Shaw said that Plato was the dramatist who invented Socrates, even as the four evangelists were the dramatists who invented Jesus. This may be going too far, but there is a certain truth in it. In one of the dialogues of Plato, he speaks about books in a rather disparaging way. And he says, "What is a book? A book seems like a picture to be a living being. And yet, if we ask it something, it does not answer. And then we see it is dead." And in order to make the book into a living thing, he invented, happily for us, the Platonic dialogue, the dialogue that forestalls the reader's doubts and its questions. But we might say also that Plato was wistful about Socrates, that after Socrates' death, he would say to himself, now, what would Socrates have said about this particular doubt of mine? And then, in order to hear once again the voice of the master he loved, he wrote the dialogues. In some of these dialogues, Socrates stands for the truth. In others, Plato has dramatized his many moods, and some of those dialogues come to no conclusion whatever, because Plato was thinking as he wrote them. He did not know the last page when he wrote the first. He was letting his mind wander, and he was dramatizing that mind into many people. But I suppose his chief aim was the illusion that despite the fact that Socrates had drunk the hemlock, Socrates was still with him. I feel that to be true, because I have had many masters in my life. I am proud of being a disciple, a good disciple, I hope. And when I think of my father, when I think of the great Jewish Spanish author, Rafael Cancinos Asens, when I think of Macedonio Fernandez, I would also like to hear their voices. And sometimes I train my voice into a trick of imitating their voices in order that I may think as they would have thought. They are always about me. There is another sentence, one of the fathers